Hello, Salem, and welcome to CC Media Presents Our Community Matters. I'm your host, Clark Hilton. We're glad you're here. Salem, like many cities, has a housing crisis that affects all of us in some way. A lot has happened to the housing market from the 2008 Great Recession up through the COVID pandemic years, and we're going to dive into this topic today. Our guests are Virginia Stapleton, Salem City Councilor representing Ward 1. She's chair of the city's Housing Authority. And joining her is Melanie Fletcher, Assistant Housing Administrator of Operations with the Housing Authority. They're here with us to talk about the housing crisis, how we got here, some of its effects, and what the city is doing to alleviate the housing shortage. Thank you both for joining us today. Appreciate having you here.
Thank you so much for having us. I'm really glad and excited to have this conversation with you and the whole community as well.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to talk about a lot of things that create a housing crisis, but let's start with a definition of affordable when it comes to affordable housing that's going to be talked about today.
Sure, yes, thank you. When we think about affordable housing, we lean on the we lean on the HUD definition of affordable housing, and that is going to be 30% of any family's annual income, and that includes not only their mortgage or their rent, but also their utilities, of course, as well.
Okay. And when it comes to rent and affordable housing, how does that apply?
Sure, thank you. I brought up my notes here because I really wanted to tell this story really well. And so when we think about jobs in our community, when we're talking about, say, a bank teller or a security guard or maybe a cashier or a manager at a fast food restaurant, they're bringing in about $30,000 to $40,000 a year. And what that means when it's 30% of their housing, that's anywhere between $775 a month in rent to $1,000 in rent a month. And as you know, that is a price that we don't see around town at all. Yeah. And when we go up even a little bit higher to jobs that bring in $40,000 to $50,000 or $60,000 a year, we're looking at a rent of about $1,000 a month to just under $1,500. So those numbers should surprise you and really bring into focus that there are a lot of people in our community who have these great jobs that we would really honor and respect people who do that work. They're working hard to bring in an income, but that 30% mark is just really hard for them to hit when their income is at the rate that it is.
Yeah. Melanie, do you have something that you wanted to add?
So for folks who have lower incomes, people who live off of Social Security or disability, or who have entry-level jobs that don't pay as much, finding those units that they can afford is almost impossible. And that's where important resources like rental assistance, such as the Housing Choice Voucher Program, come into play, where those families pay rent based on their income, and then the Housing Authority makes up that difference and can pay the rest of the rent directly to their landlord.
So if you've lived in Oregon long enough, you eventually hear the wisecrack, oh, the whole houses cost so much because the Californians have moved in. And okay, interstate rivalries aside, what actually does affect housing costs?
Yeah, this is a really interesting thing that people don't really pay attention to until you actually ask them this question, and then of course it all makes sense. There is the cost of land and interest rates to buy that land and to secure the funding to build a project. There are material costs, which with inflation are going through the roof. And then, of course, there are labor costs, and those wages are going up as well. We've seen massive increases in wages, which is fantastic news, but it does have a downstream effect. And I think that all of those things combined really just drive up the whole cost. And then, of course, we have labor shortages, which we can't talk about this topic and not talk about that. We have a lack of folks who are in the trades. We've had that lack for years, some would say decades, and that's really starting to show. When you can't find people to do the work, right, then the wages for the people who are actually doing that work go up, and the problem continues to get even bigger and bigger, and therefore the cost of housing goes up as well.
And then in the development of affordable housing, it often takes a multi-layered approach, putting together a package of federal funding, local funding, state funding to try to subsidize those costs so that in the end, the developer can actually deliver a project where rents can be set to be affordable to people at lower incomes. So that adds a whole other layer of complexity to the mix and makes those projects take a longer time. And the longer it takes for you to deliver those projects, the more the costs are going up over time. So we often see affordable projects where they're about to close financially and there's a gap because it's taken so long to get them to that point that costs have increased. And so then that has to be covered and it becomes very difficult to create affordable housing. So it's hard to do market rate housing with all of these factors, but it makes it even more difficult to create something that's affordable for people who have lower incomes.
Yeah. So I guess we're going to be a little Shakespearean here. All the devils are here, right? Lots of factors go into the housing crisis. So how did we end up here?
Sure. Yes, I think that it all really stems back to the Great Recession, where we really started to see just a complete stop to production for a decade or so, really just limited development happening across the nation. I believe right now, in 2020, the stat was that we were short on supply by almost 4 million units across the entire nation.
Wow.
And so that all starts to have a really big effect when you think about a bottleneck in this process of our growing communities. That's going to have really far-reaching effects.
And that affects Salem because Salem is growing as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I recently read an article about housing in Oregon, and it's an article that was detailing Governor Kotek's Housing Advisory Council starting to make some not official suggestions, but it leaked out that, let's change the urban growth boundary, do a one-time type of thing, which I'm sure if that were to come to fruition would open up a whole can of worms. But something that really struck me was a quote from a resident in that article saying, voters are concerned about homelessness, not affordable housing. And I was taken aback because while homelessness has a number of factors, it's very much also intertwined with housing supply. So talk to us about how those two connect.
I would love to talk just a little bit before we kind of get more into the details of this about kind of the supply chain or the chain of housing. Not only do we have what you mentioned, our unhoused neighbors that are living either in managed or unmanaged camps, to micro shelters and our navigation center and all of those kind of emergency type shelters or short-term shelters. But we have all the way up to single-family homes. There is a huge crisis right now in missing middle housing. You'll hear that term. And what that means is that we are missing really like micro apartments. We're missing things like townhomes. What's the word I'm looking for?
Can I interrupt you there? What
yeah.
is a micro apartment?
Sure. So we have one of these downtown, actually. A micro apartment, you might not have, it's kind of like a studio apartment, but even smaller in some senses. They don't have a dishwasher or, they're very almost utilitarian. Is that a good word for it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's just the bare minimums of what a person needs in order to kind of get on their feet or get out of their parents' house or find a place to live for their first job when they're out of college. It's that landing pad of just, what do I need? Bare minimums to survive. A micro apartment fits perfectly for that. So with that whole kind of chain of housing options, right? There's we're kind of heavy on our single family homes, but we've always had a lack of multifamily housing, but now we're starting to see this lack of middle housing. So fourplexes and duplexes, those types of things that are all missing from the picture. So all of that leads to a supply and demand problem.
Yeah.
And so that leads to our unhoused crisis. I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Right. So just like Virginia was talking about, it's that, we have this kind of a stream, right? It used to be that you would get your first apartment and maybe you'd be there for a little while and you might move into a duplex or a better apartment and then eventually get into a starter home and keep going. And what's happening is, just like we were talking about earlier, folks are renting for longer. And so those apartments that traditionally used to be what we call naturally occurring affordable housing. So they're at the lower end of the rental spectrum, but not because of any regulations or any special funding that goes into those units. They might just be older, or the property owner has had it for a long time and they don't need to raise the rents in order to continue to have income from their rental property. So as folks occupy those longer, it's a backlog of people who can't get into that starter housing, which is where places like the micro apartments and that middle housing kind of comes into play. If we can create places for people to be able to go that they can afford, it'll help alleviate some of this bottleneck in the housing continuum. The other issue is that rental assistance is a very limited resource. Federal funds can only go so far, and as rents have increased in the community, all housing authorities nationwide have seen increases in their costs and what they are paying on behalf of their clients. And what happens is, we are funded as a block of money, and you can house as many people as you can house with that block of money. And it just doesn't go as far as it used to anymore because it's costing more per household to keep them housed. So it's a very multifaceted issue.
Yeah, speaking to that a bit, we were out at Church at the Park recently seeing their new young adult micro shelter on Turner Road, and we were told some of these people have jobs. They just can't afford the homes or rent. Yeah. So what resources are there for people who are unhoused in Salem?
There are a lot of different resources. Traditionally, city government hasn't really played a role, but now we're increasing that even more. So beyond the warming networks that we have and our cooling networks during the summer, we also have teams that go out. We call it our SOS team. They go out to camps and help with sanitation and getting people connected to services. We have our micro shelters. We have partners in the community like UGM who have their shelter, of course, or Samanka House, Arches. Those are all really great resources for people who are struggling with being unhoused. And then we have our micro shelter locations like you just mentioned. We have 3 of those, and we are continuing to help people find permanent housing from those different sites. And then, of course, we have our new Navigation Center, which is a 75-bed location that really helps to just stabilize people. It helps them get connected to if they're missing their driver's license or they don't have their birth certificate or social security card. And then also helps give them access to health care, mental health care especially. When you are unhoused, that is a traumatic experience. And so there is a lot of healing that needs to happen, even from a person experiencing homelessness for a very short time. There's a lot of damage that's done. And so they're there to help kind of bring that stability in and help them get back on their feet. So we're offering a lot of different resources for people at the city level, but also the Salem Housing Authority has their programs as well.
Right. We have an outreach team that actually goes out and interacts with folks who are experiencing homelessness, helps them navigate those systems, helps them get linked up to the various shelters and services that we have within the city. We also own and operate, we actually opened the first permanent supportive housing project in Salem back in August of 2020, August
Can you
of 2020.
tell us a little bit about that?
So that's Redwood Crossings. It's offers 31 units of supportive housing that have project-based vouchers tied to them. So the folks who are in there pay rent based on their income. They don't have to pay utilities. The Housing Authority actually covers all the utilities for the building. So if someone comes in with 0 income, they don't have to pay any rent. And there are supportive services that are there on site to help folks become stable and remain stable in their housing. That's the ultimate goal. We also have another permanent supportive housing project that's coming online, hopefully early 2024, called Sequoia Crossings. And then we also recently opened up Yaquina Hall, which, while it's not permanent supportive housing, it is housing with supportive services on site. And that's now fully leased. So we do have pathways for folks to get into permanent housing. Obviously, it's a limited resource, but our outreach team helps people get their names on those waiting lists, get them hooked up with the services that they need in order to get into housing as the ultimate goal.
And I have to say, from a personal standpoint, I do like to hear this. My first job in media, I mean, media never paid well, right? But it was a job at the Oregon coast in Newport, and while they paid the best that they could, it was below living wage. And I ended up in Section 8 HUD housing, no dishwasher, but didn't have to pay the utilities. And that helped me. Otherwise, I couldn't have taken that job. So, I mean, and worse things could have happened, right? But it's important. It's important. How does the city of Salem help create affordable housing for people here?
So the Housing Authority owns a wide variety of housing. We have public housing units, which is a traditional HUD-funded program. And then we have a variety of affordable housing units, most of them without direct rental subsidy. So these are places that have funding from the federal government in the form of tax credits or local or state funding that have gone into these projects and kept them affordable to folks who are, I think most of ours are for folks who are at 60% of the area median income and below. And then we do have some other projects that have rental subsidy that go along with them. So again, people will be paying rent based on their income. Our biggest program is the Housing Choice Voucher Program, or Section 8, as it's commonly known. We house about 3,000 households throughout Salem and Kaiser through that program. Some of those vouchers we have converted to project-based vouchers, which are actually tied to units. So people have, when they come up on those waiting lists, they actually have a place. They don't have to go out and look for their housing. The Section 8 program, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, traditionally though, that's the one everybody thinks about or when they hear that term of, rental assistance, and that's the one folks really want because it allows you to go out and search for your own housing and select the place that best meets your needs. So we have that program. We also are continually looking for ways that we can develop more affordable housing for our community. And then we work with the city to offer a tax exemption program for nonprofit developers and developers with whom we partner.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you can talk about what's coming to mind is affordability and keeping things in affordability.
Oh, yes.
And I'd
yeah.
love for you to talk about this and maybe even give an example of a recent project that the city worked very hard at
Thank you.
doing.
Yes, that's a very good reminder. So there's the tax credit program, which I mentioned a few times, or it used to be called Section 42, like way back in the day when you first started to see it really come about. And there were a lot of projects in the state of Oregon that received their tax credits in the early to mid 1990s. So tax credits have a regulation. The property developer has an agreement that they say, okay, we'll work with these tax credits in exchange for a 30-year period. We're going to keep these rents below market. So you can imagine early to mid 90s was about 30 years ago. So recently, when they come out of affordability, those property owners have the opportunity they can go through and re-syndicate their tax credits, so they can go through that process again and get an influx of funds into the project to do rehab and that kind of thing. But again, then they're going to be in that 30-year contract again to keep the units affordable. Or they have the option to go to market rate and come out of affordability. So the recent example in the city of Salem was Orchard Park Apartments. So we had a 241 unit complex that was coming out of affordability. They were not going to re-syndicate the tax credits, and so folks were starting to get, they were starting to re-rent those units at a higher rate. And so fortunately, we were through a public-private partnership, we were able to preserve the affordability at Orchard Park. So it's preserved, so those 241 households there were not displaced. They won't lose the affordability, and it'll continue to be affordable into the foreseeable future.
Awesome. Before we talk about getting out of the housing crisis, we have a few extra minutes, and I wanted to ask you if there's anything specifically that you'd like to address that we haven't talked about today in regard to the housing crisis in Salem. Yeah.
I would like to touch on a couple of things that the city is doing. I know the Salem Housing Authority and the city of Salem there's this overlap. But the city of Salem is also doing a lot to try to address the housing crisis. We have what's called urban growth areas or urban development. I'm blanking on the name. So we have these areas like downtown, and those areas, we have the ability to do incentives to help with affordable housing in those areas. So I believe we have 8 different areas around town, and earlier you mentioned gap funding at the start of the show. And that's what we can really do with that money. So we can take that money and leverage it for these projects. So as they're trying to come together and develop this project, they're coming up against this little gap at the end. And we're able to step in as the city and say, we're going to get that for you. But then also that money comes with strings attached, and that's affordability for the most part. There's lots of different things that we can attach to those monies. The other thing that we can do is regulations. We can release and kind of ease up on regulations so that development can go faster. So the city just went through the Our Salem planning review, and what that did was change all of our codes. And we went through and looked at all of the different areas throughout the city and how can we get more multifamily housing? How can we do mixed-use developments? How can we create more infill projects? So as we're developing, we're getting close to the urban growth boundary, we have to come back to the center of our city and look at all of those maybe underutilized spaces or empty spaces where we can get creative and build housing in those spaces so that we increase our stock, which then of course drops the rental rates. So those are all things that we're doing to really increase how people can get creative with the money that they have, with all of the challenges that come with development, so that they can move forward with projects and create more housing within Salem. So,
do you find that creates? I know Oregon has a law against single-family zoning,
sure.
But do you find that if you try to add higher density housing, that are there neighborhood associations that kind of push back, like, well, not in my backyard kind of thing, or is that a challenge sometimes?
Yeah, it is a challenge, and I think every city across the globe is going to run into that. And I think the biggest thing is that change is hard. Every kind of change is hard. And so when you have lived in your neighborhood for a long time or a short period, but you moved there for a certain reason or a certain feel, and now you're seeing a housing development go in, or even we get more pushback when it's affordable housing, sadly, because there are a lot of stereotypes that go along with this. I hear a lot of really disturbing things about apartments and what people think of people who rent apartments. So there is a lot of work that we need to do as a community to change the way we think about housing and about people who live in different types of housing, to really become more welcoming in our communities. And yes, so there is pushback, but I think that you have a council in place right now that is really positive towards that change and the needed change in mindset. There's also an understanding that Salem is a small town, and we're not a small town anymore, right? We have blown past those numbers, and we are really having growing pains. And that's what this really looks like to me when I'm in those conversations. So it's important, I think, as city leaders and people who are in developing these areas to be sensitive to those maybe concerns or fears, whether they're based in a real situation or maybe a past experience or maybe it's a bias of some kind. But to really, we all have to lead with grace, continue to have strong leadership on where we're going, but also understand that sometimes it takes a gentle coming along for the whole neighborhood. So those are the things that I find in my different neighborhood associations and different community groups that I meet with.
And I appreciate you saying that too.
Yeah.
So we could probably have another half-hour conversation on this, but how do we get out of the housing crisis?
Well, luckily, it's a pretty straightforward answer, and that is to build more houses, right? And houses all across the continuum. We've talked about that from needing more micro shelters all the way up to single-family homes. Even though you're right, we don't have a code for single-family houses, doesn't mean you can't build them. But we need all of that in order to alleviate those pressure points that we're in right now. I can have 10 more micro shelter locations, but that doesn't solve homelessness and it doesn't solve the housing crisis. That just becomes the next bottleneck. So in order to relieve that bottleneck, we need housing at every level across the city to really help address the issue at hand.
And Melanie, I see you nodding your head. You've
Right.
been doing this now for a very long time. So,
Right.
yeah.
I have. So I would just add to that, the on the other side of that, we need more housing, but we also need more resources to provide rental assistance and subsidy to folks who are at a very low income level or extremely low income as it's defined by the federal government. Because folks who are living on Social Security, like I said, or disability, or who have those entry-level jobs that don't pay very well, they're going to need that leg up even if we have the housing units out there for them. So,
Yeah, I would love to just mention that, especially when we think about our senior citizens within our community, this is a spot that, I don't know about you, it's every time I see, our unhoused population, it's hard. It's hard to witness that. And I think that's why people have such strong feelings about it, is it really opens up your humanity or touches that. But when I see our senior citizens that are unhoused, that's really, Melanie and I were talking about this yesterday, that just gets right at me. And I don't want to live in a community or a society that's okay. And so I think moving forward, not only do we need to address the supply and all of the different things that go with that, but also we need to continue to lean in as a community to honestly look at the issues that we're facing as a community, and really lean into a community that cares, right? So much of our culture is individualistic, and I'm hoping that we can really come around, especially our senior citizens that are experiencing houselessness right now, and come together and say that's not okay, and we're gonna work to fix that. And so I think that's really important to really come together over this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really think this has been a great conversation today that's hopefully another toehold or foothold in the bigger scheme of things. So, Councilor Stapleton, I know you're very busy. Appreciate you coming in on the show to talk about a passion of yours, housing. And Melanie Fletcher, I appreciate you being here too, and the service you've given to the Housing Authority as well. And we hope that you found this conversation a helpful starting point in understanding Salem's housing crisis. It's a complicated problem with socioeconomic factors that require comprehensive strategies. There's no quick fix, but with thoughtful solutions, it can be made better over time. Thank you for joining us. And remember, our community matters. We'll see you next time.